topic I want to focus on today is part of a leadership and governance research stream within WOW. And the topic is recognizing and developing the collective nature of leadership. So I'm going to suggest it's important that we first of all, and this is where the power of research is, that we start to recognize, we understand, and based on that, develop. And I'm going to argue that it's something that our dominant paradigm, the way we make sense of leadership, is we tend to think of it through an individual lens. And the way we make sense of that is through these various lenses that we've developed for our books. Ken Parry and I, a very short, fairly interesting and reasonably cheap book about studying leadership. What we've suggested, those three lenses at the top, position, person, performance, are the ones that are the lenses that get used most often, most particularly by the mass media, as well as the social media, and also by the practices or leadership development practices within organizations. So when people think leadership, they think, oh, it's the person at the top of the organization, the boss who's running the organization. Or when they use the person lens, they say there's something quite exceptionally good or exceptionally bad about that leader. It's the personality, the charisma of the individual. Or they focus on, when they use the performance lens, there's either exceptionally good or exceptionally bad performance, and that's where leadership gets judged or assessed. What we argue in the book is that there are three other lenses which are equally as important but tend to get marginalized. Partly because they're very difficult to get a grasp on and they don't make very good headlines, particularly in a very single sort of message type based society. So we want to argue that actually it's really important to develop the process lens, how leadership is created, as well as the place lens, where leadership is created, and more fundamentally, and probably most important of all, is why leadership is created, through the purpose lens. Now, those that have applied the process, that have really got focused on trying to understand how leadership is created, have basically advocated a need to develop more collective understandings of leadership. And you'll see there just a sampling of the variety of forms of collective leadership, different brands that have been offered by academics or consultants. And but they do have this in common. They do share a common theme of sharing leadership among people rather than relying on a supreme source. And so just to give you a kind of example, at the top there, co-leadership basically argued that in fact when you look at an organization, there's often a number one or number two that work very closely together, or in some instances there are actually co-directors or co-CEOs of organizations that are becoming increasingly prevalent. There are those that focus on shared leadership, which look at the executive team or the board within an organization, how they create leadership throughout the rest of the organization. And then there are those that look at distributed, dispersed leadership, complex leadership, which actually observe leadership within and beyond the organization as well. So it's a kind of question of extent. Now, I've recently been involved co-editing a special issue of Human Relations along with Sonia Espino, Rebecca Foldy and Gail Fairhurst, where we've attempted to map the various different approaches to leadership. And just if you look at the bottom scale there, we've made a distinction between those that actually think collective leadership is a type of leadership. So here's co-leadership, here's shared leadership, here's how it's done, versus those that actually say, no, it's a question of what you're observing. If you're just focusing on the leader, you're missing the followers in this equation here. You actually need to think much more systemically about that. And that's where the distinction at the top of on the left-hand side is important too, because we're actually suggesting that when you look at any group, a team or an organization or whatever, you can actually see leadership residing there. We often describe this as being leadership is what is in between, the spaces in between people, as they identify, create a common sense of identity, a common purpose in a common direction. So it's important to kind of see this as, there are some people that think of this as an ideal type, we need to lead more collectively, and there are those that actually say, you know what, leadership is fundamentally collective. If you haven't got followers, you haven't got leadership. And it's not so much a, quote, new phenomenon, it's just a question of historically we've tended to focus on those that are at the top, the heroic leaders, as opposed to what we call the post-heroic forms of leadership. So what does this have to do in terms of practice within organizations and where we should be investing in our leadership development? Well, look, The thing I'm going to argue, and my colleagues argue, is that we need to move away from a preoccupation with the individual former leader. We invest so much money and so much time developing the people at the top of the organisation at the expense of those who have to practice and create leadership throughout. So we need to start thinking about how we're going to create leadership throughout the organisation. By the way, this is not just a question of saying everybody, hey, everybody's a leader. This is actually saying, what we're interested to do is creating common forms and collective forms of leadership throughout the organisation, different levels, and also with our key stakeholders, so our suppliers, our consumers, our regulators, etc. too. So the other thing that I want to emphasise is there is a tendency to think about, look, it's either top-down or hierarchical leadership or bottom-up, informal leadership. The critical thing is those processes of leadership are always in play. The trick is, how do we find ways in which they connect? How do we create a creative tension between those? So it's not suggesting that we ignore the formal hierarchy, and it's not suggesting we just focus on the informal. It's how they come together. And to think about leadership development in a variety of contexts in the boardroom, in governance, between organisations, private, public, not-for-profit, and my particular passion and focus is around the use of collective leadership to promote place-based leadership, so looking at that place lens.